Davis, MP. I'm the chair of the All-Party Group on Air Pollution, and I'd like to give you a very warm welcome to this very important meeting. I should mention a couple of things to kick off, and that is people here will no doubt be aware of the latest coroner's report on Ella Kissimmee Deborah's tragic death, which, as you know, last December he had a verdict of air pollution being a cause of her death, a young girl who died in South London. And he's just released a further report, Prevention of Future Death report, in which he recommends that World Health Organization air quality standards are embedded in the law in order that there are limits, enforceable limits, to save, thousands of children and tens of thousands of adults' lives. So that's something that we hope will go into the Environment Bill. And I would urge everyone here actually to write to their MPs to suggest that World Health Organization air quality limits do go forward in the Environment Bill. And I should add that the EFRA Environment, Fisheries, Rural Affairs Select Committee, which I serve on, has also made that recommendation, which is an all-party select committee chaired by the Conservative MP Neil Parish. So back to business, COP26 is fast approaching, and what this meeting is about is to basically say that air pollution should be centre stage in that as the most tangible and obvious mechanism by which individual people can make a contribution to reduce the prospect of climate change, in particular by emphasising the health impacts. And we know now that something like 64,000 people die prematurely from air pollution each year, and obviously the smaller particulates are attacking unborn babies, got problems with dementia, all sorts of other problems. And clearly we've done a report on the link with coronavirus, something like an 8% increase in death rates in higher polluting areas found by Harvard, more like 14% found by the German research that's been done. So this is on people's minds, and this is an opportunity for us to say, look, if we want to sort climate change, we've got to sort air pollution, and there's 7 million people a year dying from air pollution. So perhaps wouldn't it be good if we were the first country to actually embed World Health Organization air quality limits into our law to show global leadership for Britain in the way ahead. So without further ado, we've got a rich sort of galaxy of stars to speak to us briefly before you'll have an opportunity to give your questions. So I'd like to invite, first of all, David Joff, the head of carbon budgets at the Climate Change Committee, who's a central thinker as we approach COP26. Over to you, David. A warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Geraint, and good morning, everyone. So I've got a few slides, so I'm going to share, but mainly I'm going to be talking. So let's see if that works. Hopefully that's working for everyone. Well, good morning. So I'm head of carbon budgets at the Climate Change Committee, and our focus is mainly climate change, but especially in the last couple of years, we have been paying increasing attention to air quality and the links between tackling one and tackling the other. So I'll give you a brief run through of the work that we've done and what that might mean for air pollution. Okay, so to start, this is just an overview. I won't talk through the entire slide. Basically, this is to say that in December 2020, the Climate Change Committee recommended the sixth carbon budget required by the Climate Change Act, which last week the government announced it was accepting the recommendation. So that's great, and I took great joy in editing this slide in the run up to this event to take away the word recommended. This is now agreed. It's a sharp reduction in emissions. It's something close to a 2/3 reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the next 15 years, much more rapid in the next 15 years than the final 15 years to get to net zero by 2050. So just to set that as a scene, that's now agreed, that will be law as of the summer, and I'll talk through now what that might mean for air quality. So I think this is the most useful chart to talk through in terms of what do our scenarios mean. Essentially, there are 4 categories of ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in our scenarios. One is on the demand side, that's both improved energy efficiency and reduced reduced demand for things that emit. So that's basically, you know, an unvarnished positive for both climate change and air quality. If you stop burning as much stuff, broadly speaking, is going to be positive for both. Then the second category is electrification and hydrogen and CO2 capture. And if we kind of combine that, I guess, with the third one there, which is decarbonising the energy supply that we've already got, that's a largely positive story for air quality. So what we see in terms of electrification, that's electrification of heating. So, for example, heat pumps in people's homes. I've got a heat pump just outside my home here. It's electric vehicles. It's use of electricity in industry as well for high temperature heat potentially there as well. So electrification across a range of things. And where we can't electrify, we've got hydrogen, and that's generally burning hydrogen rather than using it in a fuel cell. So there is combustion there, and there will be NOx emissions there, but it's unclear whether that's actually any worse in terms of NOx emissions than what we do at the moment in terms of burning usually fossil gas in those applications. So that wedge is positive from an end use perspective. Then you've got to think about, well, where do you get this energy from? Where do you get the electricity from if you're electrifying all of these things? And the really positive story there, and it's been driven by the incredible transformation in the economics of renewable electricity over the last decade, particularly solar, but also wind, is actually our scenarios have, although it has a doubling of electricity consumption between now and 2050, there's actually a reduction in the amount of combustion going on. So more than all of that growth is met by growth in wind and growth in solar and so non-combustion forms of energy. We've actually got a reduction of 1/3 in the amount of electricity coming from burning things. So that's overall, that's positive for air quality as well as decarbonisation. And we think that can be done at little additional cost in terms of that electrification or that decarbonisation of the electricity supply. Hydrogen can come from a range of sources. Some of that will be from electricity. Some of that will probably need to be from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. But the whole thing about carbon capture and storage, we have it both on the electricity supply at the margin where maybe the wind isn't blowing or where electricity demand is particularly high, and we need sources that we can just turn on, and that often will be burning stuff. That's at the margin, and similarly for hydrogen, those are large plants. You can control the emissions, you can capture the CO2, but you can also clean up the other emissions. So that is broadly a positive. The last segment then I want to come on to is the greenhouse gas removals. Now, we tend to think of this in two quite separable chunks. One is this is taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, basically, and one way of doing that is by natural means. You'll be aware of the technology known as trees as a long-standing form of way of doing that, and we have an increase in forest cover in the UK, for example, increasing from 13% at the moment to 17% in our scenario. So that's pretty significant, and that draws down quite a lot of carbon. But we don't think that will go as far as we need it to go, and so we need the other category, which is what we call engineered removal. So that's permanent geological sequestration of the CO2, which might be a direct air capture machine, so literally sucking CO2 out of the air and burying that underground, or it might be through using biomass. The assumption is often that the natural thing, growing trees, is good for the environment and so on, which of course it is good for the wider environment. It's not always good for air quality. And so it really is important to choose the right tree species and grow them in the right places in order to get air quality benefits or to avoid the disbenefits there. And on the engineered side, the more that we can just suck CO2 out of the atmosphere rather than burning the biomass, the better it will be for air quality. So that's just a tour. That's the main focus of my presentation, a tour through what's in our scenarios. I'll just, I've got a couple more slides, but they'll be brief. So just to say, within our advice, so that what I've just presented there is what we call our balanced net zero pathway. That's having looked at the different ways of getting to net zero, and actually there are not that many different ways of getting to net zero, because a really challenging target on the climate change side. But having looked at those ways, this is our kind of central path through that. But we've looked at more extremes there. The one I'd want to flag here is what we call our widespread engagement scenario, where we do have, broadly speaking, more action on the demand side, less greenhouse gas removal, less use of hydrogen combustion, less use of carbon capture and storage. So broadly speaking, that scenario is the one that maximizes the co-benefits of climate action, including on the air quality side. So if you're interested, please do go and have a look at that and see actually, you know, how can we do that and get to net zero and get all of these co-benefits. It's challenging, so I wouldn't say, oh, we can just choose that and be guaranteed to succeed, but it's worth having a look at. The final slide then is just a flag. There was work done by the air quality expert group with input from us last year. I've put a chart here from that, looking at the impact of net zero pathways on air quality. That was based on our previous analysis, and it's fair to say our newer analysis probably is better for air quality than our 2019 scenario for net zero. And then there's ongoing work working with the Royal Society on their report, which will be due out before the COP climate conference later this year. And we've got ongoing modelling with Imperial College to take our pathways and really look at the detailed air quality implications. I will stop there.
Right, David, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions at the end. I know I'm interested in the issue of not burning wood in power stations, but you know, keeping them as carbon storage and the like. We'll talk about that later, perhaps. So without further ado, can I invite Professor Claire Reeves of East Anglia University, and of course a member of the DEFRA Air Quality Expert Group, to give us her thoughts. Over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm now just going to try and share my screen. Bear with me a moment. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So as David just mentioned, the Air Quality Expert Group, which is a DEFRA group, but wrote this report on impacts of net zero pathways on future air quality in the UK. And this report was not only for DEFRA, but for the devolved administrations as well. Right, and in that particular report, we looked at the further ambition scenario that was developed by the Committee of Climate Change that David's just referred to. So it's their scenario they developed in 2019, so not the most recent one. And we did this through a workshop, which David was at, and there were other representatives from places like DFT, Public Health England, BEIS, and the Environment Agency. And what we were really looking at were various different actions that were being proposed by the Climate Change Committee. And we were focusing on them as really what are the hazards for air pollution rather than the risks, because you can essentially mitigate hazards and reduce the risk, but it was very difficult for us at this stage to really know the full level of implementation and mitigation. So we really identified hazards rather than the level of risk. And we looked at the impact of each of these actions on 5 different types of pollutants, so particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, volatile organic compounds, and ammonia. And obviously in looking at the implementation of an action, we have to have some sort of counterfactual to compare that with. So if it was a single action, we compared it with what we would consider a business as usual case. Where there were multiple actions, we then compared this with what was the best alternative at the time of intervention. Now I'm putting this slide up, not with the expectation that you'll be able to read all the detail, but just to explain to you a bit more about what we did. So if we look at the table here, in the second column, it lists each of the different actions proposed. And then for the 5 pollutants, we then made an estimate as to whether it was going to have a positive or negative effect on air quality. And we tried to give some sort of value to that by sort of a degree of how positive or how negative. So when I say positive, I'm saying it's positive for air quality, which means there's a decrease in the air pollutant. And that's, so for each action, we looked at the 5 pollutants and we came up with this evaluation as to whether it was positive or negative. As I say, it's very difficult to quantify this because it's unclear the exact level and the way that things will be implemented. So the scale of the implementation and the actual way things implemented. As Dave said, there are differences in the way you, for example, use hydrogen. We also took a more pessimistic view intentionally, because what we wanted to do was to identify where there were antagonisms between improving or say reducing carbon, but where it might lead to a worsening of air pollution. So by identifying these, we can then point out how these things can be mitigated. But the good thing was that virtually all of the actions led to improved air quality, or that's how we envisaged them. So that's the good news. So what I'm going to do is just summarize this. We looked at 47 different actions, and I'm just going to summarize our conclusions. So for road and rail transport, clearly, if we bring in electrification, that's going to lead to very substantial reductions in nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds, particularly at roadside. However, just a slight warning here is that if you reduce NO emissions very close to the source, you can increase ozone. We think this is going to be hugely offset by the benefit of reducing NO2, but it's just something to be aware of. Again, if you reduce exhaust emissions, you're going to reduce particulate matter from exhaust. But again, another caveat here, the emissions from the modern vehicles now for particulate matter is primarily not through the exhaust, but through friction type processes such as tyre wear, brake wear, erosion of the road surface and dust resuspension. And obviously, that's not going to be removed by changing to electric vehicle directly. And this possibility, it could even increase because you might find that more miles are driven, and also these emissions are somewhat dependent on the mass of the vehicle. However, there are ways of offsetting it, such as regenerative braking, and also there are new mitigation technologies to capture the particles in the brake systems. Clearly, if we were to move to walking, cycling and public transport, that would be good for both climate and for air quality. Now, agriculture is another area where there's potentially substantial improvements of air quality when looking at actions to reduce, well, not carbon, but greenhouse gases. And that's primarily in the form of ammonia. So ammonia emissions can be reduced substantially if we have fewer animals, if we improve the use of fertilizer and waste management. Now, ammonia can lead to particle formation. When you mix ammonia and the chemistry of ammonia with nitrogen oxides from other sources, it can lead to particulate matter. So if we can reduce ammonia emissions, we will also improve particulate matter concentrations both in urban and rural areas. And also it could lead, well, through reducing ammonia emissions, we can reduce nitrogen deposition to ecosystems. Another area of improvement that would come from agricultural practices would be the reduction in animals farmed. We could reduce methane emissions, and methane can lead to ozone. Although it wouldn't have a big impact on ozone in the UK, it would reduce ozone globally. As David mentioned, there's plans to increase the amount of forests. And again, as he said, this is something that, whilst is a major advantage in many ways, we have to be a little bit careful because there are some trees that are particularly high emitters of volatile organic compounds. So we have to be careful in the the choice of trees that are planted. And these volatile organic compounds, through their chemistry, can lead to ozone when mixed with nitrogen oxides, and also can lead to more particulate matter. The other thing to be careful here as well, both with tree planting, but particularly with biofuels, is if you then change, for example, the practices of use of fertilizers, and if you increase the fertilizer use, you could increase nitrogen oxide emissions from soil. But likewise, if you're changing agricultural land to sort of forest which isn't using so much fertilizer, then that could have an advantage. Hydrogen, again, is a key part of the program that David mentioned. Really, there are two aspects to this in terms of air quality. One is how is the hydrogen generated. If it's through steam methane reforming, that can lead to methane emissions. But if it's produced through low carbon powered electrolysis of water, then that's a clean way of generating hydrogen. And then the key question really after that is, how is the hydrogen being used? So if it's in fuel cells, it's very clean, but if it's burnt, then it leads to nitrogen oxide emissions. Any burning process at high temperatures will convert the nitrogen and the oxygen in the atmosphere into nitrogen oxides. And so that's an issue. But if this occurs in sort of large plants, then NOx abatement technologies like we use in cars can be used in those applications. So this, again, something we need to be careful of. If we convert the gas grid over to hydrogen, that would eliminate some VOC emissions from that. So that would reduce ozone. So again, another positive. There's also talk about using ammonia. There are going to be very stringent controls over that because it's highly toxic. So that should minimize any emissions to the atmosphere from an air quality perspective. Reducing energy demand through improved efficiency is obviously going to be a good way of reducing air pollutants. But we do just have to be careful that these changes don't lead to increased air pollution indoors, primarily through limiting ventilation. So we have to be careful when we produce these new buildings or retrofit buildings to improve energy efficiency, that we then manage the air within those environments, because there's lots of pollutants in the home and in other buildings come from construction materials and different things that we do, such as cooking and other things like sort of cleaning products. So yeah, trying to sort of bring together these building efficiency projects with air quality objectives for indoors would be highly beneficial. Carbon capture storage, again, there's lots of opportunities there to reduce emissions, but we have to be a bit careful about the actual way that this is done, because there are some potential for fugitive emissions of some rather toxic chemicals which are VOCs and could lead to particulate matter. But there's big uncertainties over the actual technologies and the degree to which they'll be implemented in carbon capture storage. Some more general conclusions just to finish up with. So we have to be careful about how we transition to this net zero. So there are ways that we might introduce transitionary fuels such as biofuels, and that could obviously impact air quality as we transition to net zero. There are other projects such as nuclear and also wind, where actually the biggest sort of issue for air pollution is not the operation of these, but in the actual development of the infrastructures, the building of these large infrastructures. And whilst they might not produce much air pollution on a UK scale, they could be important locally. There are also benefits that have different short-term or temporal effects. So if we reduce NOx emissions from motor vehicles through electrification, we can have some really very immediate effects. So there's an incentive to do these actions early. There are also some non-linear effects. So I mentioned before about ammonia combining with NOx to create particulate matter. However, we really have to reduce ammonia to much, much lower levels than currently exist before that will have a significant impact on particulate matter. And similarly with nitrogen oxides, their impact on ozone, it needs to be reduced considerably before we realise the full effects. The other thing just to mention is that there's an international dimension to this. Our actions to improve air quality will also help our neighbours because we are exporting air pollution, and likewise international action, particularly across Europe, would help to improve our air quality as well. And just finally to say that virtually all of the negative air quality impacts that we've identified can be mitigated for if appropriate action is taken. Okay, thank you.
Right, thanks so much, Claire. That's fantastic. I'd say we'll have some time for questions later. There's a lot of detail there. And I know on the issue of particulates from friction versus from diesel, there's a lot of work that needs to be done on the relative toxicity of diesel particulates, which are more toxic than those from brakes and from tires. So I'm not sure to what extent that's a red herring, but we can talk about that. With no further ado, over to Sarah Woolnough, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Geraint. Delighted to join the meeting today. I will be brief, but I'm going to give a health perspective and a sense of what people with lung conditions feel about some of the issues we are discussing. So by way of introduction, Asthma UK and the British Lung Foundation merged at the beginning of 2020 to become the nation's lung charity. 1 in 5 of us over the course of our lifetime will develop a respiratory condition, and around 6.5 million have a diagnosis of living with a long-term lung condition at the moment. And so we are very interested in moves to improve air quality. We also fund medical research, we provide advice, support and services, but we campaign for a range of priorities, including lung health. As we've heard, our perspective as a charity, and when we talk to beneficiaries, tackling carbon and toxic air in tandem is clearly critical, and they are inextricably linked. And we talk a lot about transport and the carbon emissions as a consequence of transport use, both for carbon emissions and nitrogen dioxide pollution. So our perspective is ambitious action to clean up transport in the UK will deliver significant benefits for both. But in the shorter term, it's air pollution that's posing an immediate threat to people's health in the UK. It's affecting poor air quality, affecting millions of people right across the UK, particularly those with an existing lung condition. But the evidence is very clear. Air pollution impacts the growth of lungs. It stunts lung growth. It exacerbates existing conditions and is a contributing factor to new lung conditions, so lung cancers, building evidence picture around asthma as well. We also know that many people living with a lung condition really struggle on account of the poor air quality that they live with, and it's quite literally making people feel trapped in their homes, as I will come on to sort of detail some of the research that we've done with beneficiaries. Geraint, you talked about Ella Kissy-Debra's case in your introductory comments. It's something that we have been following incredibly closely. We were delighted to see the Prevention of Future Deaths report published last week, and of course government having 56 days to respond to that, as well as the strong recommendation around bolder clean air laws. The coroner made 2 other key recommendations that we're very supportive of. One is, there's still relatively low awareness of some of the impacts of air pollution and air quality across the general population, and so the coroner talked about much more effort needed to increase and educate health professionals in order that they can in turn give advice and support. And I know that's something that Ella's family feel very keenly. It was never mentioned with Ella's severe asthma that air pollution could be a contributing factor, so we're very supportive of that recommendation. And similarly, the idea that people should have much better access to information about local local air quality in their community where they live, more air pollution monitoring, in order that they can understand the issues, they can protect themselves, they can take steps in their everyday life. That's absolutely critical. Something else I wanted to just spend a moment on is the inequalities that exist around some of this. So we know that if you are in a more deprived community, you're more likely to be exposed to poor air quality, and you're least likely to be a contributor. And I know, again, that's something that has been discussed. So Ella lived very close to the South Circular, really high levels of air pollution. So we're hugely supportive of the coroner's report and look forward to seeing government's response to that. So then a word more on how poor air quality, air pollution affects people living with a lung condition. When we go out and talk to our beneficiaries, and we do very regularly, the vast majority report that living with a lung condition, if air pollution exacerbates that, and it impacts their health and well-being. So poor air quality, air pollution makes people feel out of breath, they're more likely to cough, and many people talk about feeling you know, a direct link with exacerbations, with flare-ups of their asthma, their COPD, hospital visits, and so on. And we know there's good evidence that over half of people living with asthma say that they feel air pollution is a direct trigger. But there is good news in the sense that so many people have told us and talked about, particularly in the first lockdown, feeling that air quality improved where they lived. We've got lots of beneficiary testimony around that, and they felt able to go out and enjoy the outdoors more. And so there's a big question in our mind about how we bank in some of the benefits perhaps that we saw, how we use COVID and some of the differences that we've had to live with over the past year to start more of a national conversation about how we encourage different methods of travel, how we you know, keep taking steps to reduce air pollution. And as I've said, I mean, the past year has been utterly extraordinary. It has been particularly difficult for people living with an existing lung condition. Many were shielding, and many people feel in the lung community naturally extremely anxious and have had a particularly tough year. For us as a charity, there has been a huge increase in demand on our services. So calls to the helpline, as one example, up over 500% in the first wave and the first lockdown. And I do think, you know, there's a double-edged sword here, because on the one hand it has I think shone a spotlight on lung health. People are more willing, more open to talk about how we build back better, how we need to bank some of the positive changes that have been made, and how many people did experience cleaner air and welcomed that. But of course, one of our worries coming out of the pandemic is that, you know, people may be hesitant to use public transport, and where we are taking steps to encourage greener modes of transport, the use of public transport, walking and cycling far more. We are seeing evidence that people are, as I say, sort of hesitant and more likely to use car use. So we have to, we believe, sort of focus on that very heavily. In advance of the mayoral elections, the devolved elections, we've been working very hard with local campaigners to raise these issues with decision makers, to talk about some of the measures we would like to see committed to. And of course, what we all know is there's no silver bullet around air pollution. You need a whole raft of measures, awareness campaigns, and so on. But we do know, and in conclusion, around this section of comments, that a seismic shift is needed. And so the charity is absolutely committed with our beneficiaries, with our supporters, to calling on government for much bolder action. That absolutely means taking the opportunity in the Environment Bill to set bolder clean air laws, bolder measures around PM 2.5. And there's huge support amongst our supporters, our beneficiaries, for that to happen. But we believe from a health perspective that must go hand in hand with doing much more to raise some of the issues and awareness around air pollution and poor air quality. A couple of months ago, we published a report, The Invisible Threat. We mapped levels of PM 2.5 across the UK, and particularly across schools, colleges, hospitals, GP surgeries, so that we could highlight high levels of air pollution across sort of public services. I'll just pull out one stat: around a quarter of all schools in England are situated in areas where there are very, very high levels of air pollution. And we called the report The Invisible Threat because so many people still on a day-to-day basis perhaps don't appreciate what they are breathing in and living with. But in the wake of that report published, certainly we've seen huge demand for more information and interest in this issue. And I've touched on this, I think, the idea that we can build back better, we must build back better in the wake of COVID. So then finally, a greener NHS. The health and care system in England is responsible for an estimated 4 to 5% of the country's carbon footprint, and medicines account for around 25% of emissions within the NHS. A small number of medicines we know account for a large portion of the emissions, and there's already a significant focus on two such groups: anaesthetic gases and inhalers, and inhalers responsible for 3% of emissions, where emissions occur at the point of use. The remaining 20% of emissions primarily found in the manufacturing and freight inherent in the supply chain. Therefore, we believe it's crucial the NHS does its bit to clean up the air and tackle climate breakdown. My predecessor, the previous CEO of the charity, sat on the NHS's net zero panel, and we welcome 3 sets of actions being taken by the greener NHS unit. Firstly, cleaning up the NHS fleet in the state, so the idea that we switch NHS vehicles to electric and switch to low carbon energy generation at NHS sites where we can. Secondly, supporting employees and patients to switch to active travel and public transport. Clearly this is difficult in some instances, but 3.5% of all road travel in England, that's 9.5 billion miles or around that number, related to NHS patients, visitors, staff and suppliers. So there is a significant opportunity to tackle air pollution by moving hospital related travel to walking, cycling and public transport where possible. But of course that requires investment and thinking this through quite carefully. And then thirdly, digitising patient pathways. And again, this isn't without sort of lively debate, but so much care, so many GP appointments and hospital appointments are now being done by telephone or video conference. Whilst we would always say, of course, many patients will have to be seen face to face, there is an opportunity to bank in some of the positive changes. It's good for the NHS. In some cases, it's convenient and beneficial for patients, and it can contribute to this agenda. And then Geraint, as you again outlined, with COP26 coming up, we do have opportunities, an opportunity to be a world leader. And again, from a public, a patient, a beneficiary perspective, we certainly are calling as boldly as we can on government to take that opportunity. So, final reflections. We do believe there's a unique moment and growing public pressure for change. We have an environment bill, we have COP26 coming up, we have Ella's case, air pollution cited on death for the first time, the Prevention of Future Deaths report that government has to respond to. We know clean air is critical to build back better from COVID and achieve net zero, and it's absolutely what people with lung conditions tell us they want. We need to learn and adapt from the COVID-19 response, and we've got to harness positive behaviour changes now and embed them longer term. So thank you, and that's it from me.
All right, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. That's fantastic. And again, a reminder that people can write in to their MPs about the Environment Bill, not just for World Health Organization legally binding limits, but also to have all departments having a duty to make a contribution towards cleaning up our air, the Clean Air Plan, and just here particularly what the health department can do, but obviously there's an issue for transport, local government and all the departments. And also we heard about inequalities, which are terribly important as well. And I understand as well that we've got the worst asthma rates in Britain in the whole of the EU, even though we've left the EU. Now, finally, last but not least, I'd just like to invite Jason Torrance, Assistant Executive Director of UK 100, who acts as the Secretariat for the APPG. And I should mention Liberty Charge, who provided a sponsorship for this particular meeting as well, who are rolling out the electric grid. I'm sure we'll all welcome the electric grid. So over to you briefly, Jason, and then we'll have some questions. Jason.
Great. Thank you, Geraint, for convening this and of course for your leadership in this space over many years. So everyone be pleased to know I've got no slides and I will be very brief. And just as a memoir, UK 100, we're a network of over 100 local authorities across the UK that are committed to urgent and ambitious action towards net zero and towards clean air. So what I want to do briefly is just talk about the work that we've been doing and we've been supporting specifically around the clean air summits that we've convened and the priorities that have emerged from that. And of course, we were able to convene the clean air summits, and I think there's also a lot of momentum around climate, because of course that they are two of the biggest global public health challenges that we face, and urgent and ambitious action is needed. I think due to much pressure from the likes of the Committee on Climate Change and many other actors, we are starting to get some bold and ambitious action from central government on climate. That's starting, but I think as I want to briefly outline, we're way behind, I would suggest, on clean air. However, we know that there is some bold action happening locally. We have a number of clean air zones or similar initiatives around the country. I suppose most notably and most long-standing, of course, is London's ULEZ, and that has been proven from research to cut nitrogen dioxide by about a third, and many fewer cars, about 13,500 fewer cars being driven into the zone daily. So of course that's practical and specific and effective action being taken locally. And of course the clean air zone recently being brought in my home city of Bath, and hopefully later in the year in Birmingham will have kind of similar effects over time. So in 2019, at the end before the COVID pandemic took its grip, we convened local authorities and businesses from across the UK in an international clean air summit in collaboration with the Greater London Authority. And we did that, as I said, because local authorities felt really gripped by the challenges and wanted to take action on clean air and on climate, but they felt very strongly that they wanted to communicate their commitment to bold and ambitious action, but also they couldn't do it alone. They needed some help from central government, and very specifically the four areas that they identified as priorities were, of course, around standards, and WHO being enshrined in law in the Environment Bill is absolutely critical for that. There's also a need for financial support to, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, so that the hardest hits don't come on the poorest in our society. Things like fleet renewal schemes, funding for people to shift to electric vehicles, a seamless network of electric charging networks, and funding for things like decarbonising homes, heating and gas boilers, etc. Powers, I think, is a particular challenge for local authorities, but also the power that they have is often really lacking to enable them to take bold and ambitious action on climate and clean air. And of course, lastly, around certainty. It was at the beginning of 2019, the government launched their clean air strategy. A lot has happened since. I think in large part, the Clean Air Zone initiative is coming towards the end of the road with implementation. Many local authorities have chosen not to take forward schemes. There's an urgent need for a new, bold strategy and I would say plan, and the resources to deliver the plan needed from central government to take this forward. So in summary, I think around that certainty, the need for a clean air strategy and the plan, more powers and power for local authority, financial support, and of course around standards, particularly WHO PM 2.5 standards in the Environment Bill. Of course, just in closing, we have, as some of the other speakers have mentioned, a real moment of time now, not just because we have the climate conference coming up at the end of the year, but because I think for many, many people, clean air is something that really touches their lives. We're coming out of a pandemic, and I think that has pointed the direction towards what is possible in terms of changing travel behaviour towards cleaner forms of transport, walking, cycling, public transport, but also electric, but also changing the way we live. So hopefully out of opportunity can come bold action, which is what we need from central government.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason. That's great. Right, we haven't got that much time left. So what I'm intending to do is to invite the panel to make concluding remarks. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out the questions I've got here. And I'm hoping the panelists can, I'll be starting with David, and he took least time. Congratulations, David. I'll be inviting each of them to select whatever question you want to ask. Don't answer all the questions. I'm just going to list a load of questions. And then once you think, you want to answer and you're in a best position to answer, to answer. So I'm just going to run through them very quickly. How realistic is it to expect carbon capture technology to make a difference? What is the scale of operation at the moment? Maybe one for David. There's someone saying, I'm an expert in transport refrigeration in the cold chain. I focus on diesel emission sectors. So someone who mentioned that. I understand, one of these diesel engines, the back of these lorries, sort of 100 times more than the lorry itself. What is the plan to add this sector to emissions transport? Maybe that's an EFRA question. What are we doing about diesel and refrigeration? Have we developed any thinking about actual data capture? Not sure what that's meant. A question from Professor Stephen Holgate, who everyone will know, thanking everyone for their excellent contributions and asking how we encourage health professionals to take greater ownership of air pollution as a major driver of poor health, as they did in tobacco smoking. It's not just the NHS, what was being mentioned, Phil, by Sarah talking about here, but actually the GPs and others are at the front line saying to people, let's do something about this, and keeping the charge going. There's a question, of course, about whether we want more monitors. So, people with children at schools can bang at the door, local authorities and their MPs, etc. There's a mention here about the Manchester tram. What's the role of inner city sort of light rail systems? And then there's an issue about tree cover, and a question about whether we stop burning wood altogether and instead use it to store it basically in our building construction work, in order so it captures carbon and we use less cement. So there's a few questions, and you say what you like, but try and keep it brief. And over to you, David, to set a great example as you did at the start. David.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Geraint. So yeah, I won't try and tackle all of those. I'll do the carbon capture one because that's probably best suited to me. We're not doing carbon capture on a very large scale globally at the moment. I've been saying for years, if we're not doing carbon capture, we're not taking climate change seriously. It's a major component of getting down to the kind of levels of emissions that we're going to need to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. Of course, not everything should be carbon capture, but if you go as far as you can with everything else, with demand and electrification and so on, you're still left with sources of emissions that you can't easily remove. And so carbon capture can do the last bit of that. And that's really important. We're not doing it at scale in most places in the world, and some places where that's being done to extract more fossil fuel from reservoirs and so on. So that's a big test. The government has made important commitments to carbon capture in the UK, including funding for the infrastructure, but we've been there a couple of times before already. So this is hopefully third time lucky and a big litmus test of their net zero credentials in terms of whether that can happen. So it shouldn't be the major focus of doing all the heavy lifting to get to net zero, but it's a vital component of that. I want to pick up some of the other things. I think wood, I think you're absolutely right, Geraint. There's a question of, how much should be standing stocks in trees and in our soils and our peatlands and so on. How much can be standing stocks in our buildings, and how much we grow and burn, but capture the CO2 and don't release it to atmosphere. I think we should be doing as much of the first two as we can, the standing stocks, in terms of the forests and the wood in construction. And as you say, that reduces demand for steel and cement, which are carbon intensive goods. But ultimately, we're probably limited to some extent in how much of that we can do. We have obviously limited land area in this country, and we've set out how much we think is feasible in terms of increasing the size of UK forests, and clearly, wood in construction is limited by how many new buildings are you building. So those are really good uses. I would say they should be the priority, but probably we're going to need to have faster growing energy crops and burn those as well to sequester more carbon. So it's a mix, but I absolutely agree that standing stocks and not burning stuff feels like the most important part of that. I'll leave it there. I won't try and answer.
And maybe COP26 is a geopolitical opportunity to get Russia to switch to wood instead of oil and gas, because it's got the biggest land mass, provide the world with wood for building instead of cement, and we could solve a lot of problems there.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. I'm not an expert on Russia, but that sounds great.
Yeah. So then we wouldn't have to fight with them. Over to you, Claire. What have you got? And could you mention this thing about the relative toxicity of particulates as well, as I mentioned it?
Oh, right. Yes. Sure. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the questions. One was about the data capture, and I absolutely agree. We need to monitor air quality constantly, and DEFRA has a program for doing that. But I think in particular, we need to look at where we're putting in new infrastructure or new projects specifically around, trying to reduce carbon. We therefore need to increase our monitoring around those areas. So I think where there's new infrastructure, we need to put in new and appropriate monitoring of air quality in those areas. So the particulate matter, this is a very complex question, and I completely agree that we need to have something in the Environment Bill that gets us down to these WHO levels. But having a single target doesn't always give you the outcomes that you want. You can bring down air pollution in one area to get below the target by just shifting emissions, for example, to another area. And so what we need to do is think of think of sophisticated measures and targets that allow us to improve air quality and reduce particulate exposure for everybody. It touches on your point, Geraint, about toxicity. It's not simply the number of particles, but potentially the different types of particles and their chemical composition. And this is actually extremely complex. Particulate matter is produced not by a single source. It's relatively long-lived, so it can be transported over long distances. And so it's not going to be easy, as with NO2, for a single local authority to reduce particulate matter in its area to meet that target. It has to be done at a national level, or even with international cooperation because of import of particulate matter from abroad. So DEFRA is working, has projects ongoing at the moment to look at the mechanisms, which is one of the questions that was asked, of how we, what things we can put in place to reduce particulate matter down to the sort of WHO levels, but also to look at more sophisticated measures to make sure that exposure to air pollution is improved for everyone.
But so we're clear here, we could have a right to clean air in all environments, particularly in urban environments where Alan and others have died or are dying by the thousands. We could have that as a matter of political will, isn't it? So we could, ban, I don't know, wood burning and take out cars. This is just about political will. It's not about scientific impossibility, is it? So we're clear.
No, I mean, absolutely. There are things that we can do, and as you say, political will will bring those in. But I think we just have to be aware that this is a very complex issue, and whilst there are some easy measures we can do, they're not going to bring necessarily exactly what we want straight away. I mean, I mentioned about ammonia. We have to think about agricultural emissions, and we really have to bring ammonia down before we were able to bring down ammonium nitrate, which is one of the major components of particulate matter. And that's, a widespread pollutant across, large areas, not just in urban areas. You have to bring down the background and the local sources as well.
Yeah, the Farmers Act, exactly. So Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. I'm going to make 2 points. One is to, in response to Stephen Holgate's question, fantastic question. And I worked in tobacco control for many years. My observation is we need to get the Health Department, Public Health England and associated agencies far more invested in air quality and air pollution. We need training, so that's the Royal Colleges, it's other bodies that are involved in the training of health professionals to include modules on air quality in their curriculums, but we do also need general public awareness raising campaigns. We've seen it happen with tobacco. I think the Health Department doesn't feel the sort of ownership it should do, so that is an urgent priority for us, and in fact the coroner talked very clearly about that in the Prevention of Future Deaths report. Just aligned to that, there is something about, as you say, Geraint, about local air pollution monitors. It is such a wake-up call if people really understand what levels of pollution are like in their local community. I mean, that is a huge driver for local advocacy, local campaigning. And then just to pick up on what you said, I mean, I feel our community is impatient for change. This is about political will, first and foremost. Of course, there are complexities and everything can follow from that, but now is an opportunity. And I think for everyone across the UK, particularly for the most vulnerable in society, children, older people, those with an existing lung condition, their lives are being put at risk at the moment, and we've got this brilliant opportunity this year to make progress, and I hope we take it.
So I know that Stephen Holgate, who I'm very glad is with us today, had mentioned in a previous presentation that when he had his medical training, the relationships between lung disease, asthma and other conditions and air pollution, wasn't hammered home. And if that was hammered home, and then we got all our GPs educating people of the problems, and then outside all our schools we had monitors, so that the GPs would say, yeah, that's dangerous, do something, tell your councillor, tell your MP. That would create greater momentum for change and in turn help climate change. So then we get the political will. I was talking with Professor Claire Reeds about to actually do something rather than sort of worry this might not be popular. Okay, well, thank you so much for that. And finally then, Jason, have you got any final thoughts before I close?
Yep, just very briefly, thank you. Just to pick up on the points about political will, absolutely, of course, we need political will, but we need political commitment and further resource. I think there's an absence of priority at the moment from central government. If we are to look to replicate the kind of public response and the support that we've seen recently around COVID, or that we saw around tobacco, that takes some significant resource. I would suggest looking at redirecting the money from the £27 billion road building programme might be better spent in things like improving air quality, improving education and supporting health professionals to be at the front of local efforts.
All right, thank you for that. All right, it's been a fantastic meeting. Don't forget, of course, the focus of this is very much COP26 and that linkage. Thank you to all the speakers. Again, I would encourage active political engagement with all your representatives, from councillors to, in Wales, we've got Senate members as well, and as in Scotland. You know, let them know you care about air quality, you care about climate change, get people involved, create the linkage, and we've got the Environment Bill going through. So I would really encourage people to, you know, get on the keyboard, send your emails in and let your voice be heard, because, you know, I'm an MP, and if my inbox is full of a certain issue, it certainly lifts me up to sort of take action on that. And if we do want action, we've got to take our own action. So once more, thank you so much, David. I know you're at the centre of thinking on this. Thank you, Sarah, you're doing a fantastic job. And of course, Professor Claire Reeves is very much at the centre of things in terms of DEFRA. And thank you, Jason, UK 100, and of course, Liberty Charge as well. So it's been a great meeting, and I hope to see you all again. And perhaps the presenters, when they had slides, could share those slides with us, and I can distribute them to, you know, the masses who are now on Zoom watching us. Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. I really appreciate your contributions. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Bye.